My name is Dan Holme. I am thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's session, SharePoint Demystified, or wish I had known that sooner. Let me give you a very quick introduction to myself, and then we're going to dive right into the content. My name is Dan Holme. I'm an Office 365 MVP, and I've been an MVP for about 9 years now across Active Directory, SharePoint, and now Office 365. I'm lucky enough to call Maui, Hawaii home. Steve called me out this morning. I'm not the only one now. Our SharePoint community has doubled in size now, thanks to Simeon Cathy, who now lives on a boat in Hawaii. This is what it looks like near my home, so if you're ever near there, give me a shout. We'll share a pint together because the SharePoint community is very small on Maui. But I spend most of my time traveling the world, working mostly for large Fortune caliber organizations. NBC, which is one of the large television networks in the US, is one of my customers for whom I'm the Microsoft Technologies consultant during the Olympic Games. So I was lucky enough to spend the summer of 2012 right here in London on the other side of town. Working on the Summer Games, did Sochi last winter, and we're right now starting to spin up our efforts around Rio 2016, which is just a few months from now, next summer. So I spent about 20 years as a consultant, and I hope to bring to this session a lot of the experience I've had with customers around the world and helping answer the problems that they face. I also am a speaker here at Evolution as well as at Ignite. I've done a lot of writing over the course of my life, including the SharePoint 2010 training kits for Microsoft Press. But now I am fully dedicated to a new community and resource called IT Unity. It's an awesome new site. A lot of the speakers who are here at the event are contributing excellent content. And our goal is really to be a place where you can go to solve business problems with technology. It's not just going to be about SharePoint and Office 365, although that's certainly an important and initial focus for us. But it's really about how we get things done as businesses, the different options we've got, the decisions we need to make, both as business people, as IT pros, and as developers extending these technologies. So come up and check out IT Unity if you haven't had a chance yet. We've got some great resources for you. Now, I'd like to ask, how many of you came into this session? We got a good group here. I'm actually surprised because Neil's in the other room. I wasn't sure anyone would come. How many of you came into this room actually having no clue what this session is about? Come on, admit it. Yeah, because the abstract pretty much said, come and learn some stuff, didn't it? This is what I call my grab bag session. And it really is a grab bag of tips and tricks that will help you save time and accelerate your efforts. Of clarity around some underdocumented issues and concerns around SharePoint and Office 365. Some guidance as far as where you can invest your time, especially your time, but also your money to get maximum bang for the buck. And also answers to what I find are hot topics in the community. And the way I build this session is I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of topics and points that don't tend to get full coverage at an event like this because many of these things are small, granular issues that don't take an hour to describe. I look at the event, I'm looking at what other people are speaking about, and I pick out those things that I don't think are getting covered and that I think I can add some value to. So this is literally a session that I put together when I come here and find out what's getting talked about. So there's a lot we can talk about. There are some very specific things I want to talk about based on what I'm hearing people discuss at the event and what I'm seeing covered at other sessions so that I don't overlap. But then if we've got some time, I also can open up this menu to you and sort of find out what you're interested in hearing as well. But we're definitely going to talk about some issues around deployment because many of us are still in the throes of deploying SharePoint 2013 as well as IaaS deployments in Azure. Some of us, I'm sure, are starting to look at being members of the TAP program for SharePoint 2016. We're going to be looking at deploying that. So deployment is always a big deal. So we're going to talk about some issues around deployment. We're definitely going to talk around some configuration concerns that I see in many customers, and absolutely positively going to talk about some security issues that I continue to see being fought at many customers. So we've got some things I definitely want to talk about, and then we'll see what else we have time to cover. So first big topic is automating server deployment. And I'm going to try to cover this sort of at two extremes. One is I'm going to hit the key points that I think will help you automate your server deployments and make them as efficient as possible. And then I'm going to give you a set of tools that you're going to be able to take back and put into place in your environments. We don't have all day to talk about the tools, so I'm going to have to leave those discussions for later. But I'm just going to hand you lots of what I think are very valuable scripts and tools to help you do that. So when you think about deploying a SharePoint server, you think about all of the different technologies that are involved, starting with Windows and the updates to Windows, SharePoint prerequisites, SharePoint binaries, SharePoint updates, and finally, the server configuration itself. There's a lot of elements to the stack that you have to build in order to deploy a SharePoint server. And many of those are going to be the same on every single server you build. Pretty much up to the very last box is going to be common in every single environment. And so you want to automate your deployment as much as possible for very obvious reasons. First, it makes things faster. Once you've invested in building scripts that deploy your environment, from there on it's faster. Secondly, you get more consistency, i.e. reduced error. And when things are consistent, that allows you to lead towards higher levels of security and compliance. It's replicable, so you can build it in a lab, run it in deployment, run it in your dev environments. So it's a and it also helps with disaster recovery. When things need to be updated, it's easier, or upgraded. You can just rerun the scripts. And it allows you to get to settings that you can't get to in the user interface. When you deploy by pointing and clicking, there are things you just can't get to. For a very simple example is a lot of the database names you can't control when you're setting up SharePoint, the admin DB, for example. And so your SQL team gets frustrated that they get databases with GUIDs, that kind of thing. One of the most important benefits of scripting your environment, though, I think, is documentation. Because when I, as a consultant, am called to fight fires at customers, and I ask for documents of how their environments were built, most of the documents are non-existent or exceptionally poor. Because most of us are just focused on getting the job done and going on to fight the next fire, we don't really take time to document how we built things, how we configured things. And if you've done it with a script, you have a living document of how your environment was built. And you can be certain, you can guarantee someone that you built it that way because you simply ran the script. So there's all kinds of good reasons to script deployment. Now, in order to script deployment, there's many ways to approach this. What I'm going to give you today is a set of scripts that I use, or they're very, very close to what I use with my customers, to build the farm sort of from that stack, from bare metal up to the server configuration. You're going to be able to download them from IT Unity. So if you go to itunity.com/danholm, probably tonight I'll upload the final scripts for you. You'll be able to download them as a package, as a zip file. And they're going to allow you to script the domain, and we'll talk about some of the things specifically you should be doing in Active Directory, the file server, which is basically where you'll have the distribution of SharePoint, the bits, so the SQL server and the SharePoint servers. You'll get a zip file with all those bits. And in each script, you're going to be able to open them up. You'll see they're fairly well constructed as far as how all the variables are at the top, and all you have to do is change the variables. And you can run those scripts. And I'll give you a real simple example here of one of the scripts so you can sort of see what they look like. But again, as we have a short session, I'm really just going to sort of hand this set of tools off to you and talk about them at a high level. We'll start with just this very simple idea of you need to create a distribution for all the SharePoint bits, the prerequisites, the actual SharePoint binaries, and the updates. And so when you download the scripts, they're going to be a zip file with a folder for the domain, for the file server, for SharePoint, for SQL. And by the way, at the top of the zip file, there's a script instructions file that tells you exactly how to run all these scripts. The file server script we'll start at right now, you'll see they're numbered, so you do them in order. And we're going to open up this script. And the way you open them up is actually, the way I recommend is just to open them up in the PowerShell editor. You can open them up in Notepad if you want as well. But by running the PowerShell editor as an administrator, you can not only edit the script, but you can run it as well. And the scripts all have lots and lots of comments. If you're not familiar with PowerShell, everything you're seeing in green with a hashtag at the beginning is a comment. So they're very well documented. And then there's, in almost every script, there's a configuration block that has all the variables that you need to set. So for example, your domain name, the folder you want to create and put SharePoint into. So all these variables are right here at the top, and then that's the end. That's all you have to fill in, and you run the script, and you're done. So you fill in a few variables. I'm going to click play to run the script. And in this case, it's a super simple script. All it did was go onto my C drive, and it created the SharePoint install folder, and it created a couple of subfolders. So the main thing I'm showing you here is how the scripts look. They're all well-constructed, variables at the top, and you run the script. And as we go through this very quickly in this session, I'll point out to you specific scripts. For example, file server script 11 is the one we just ran. And then there's two other scripts, 12 and 13. And what 12 and 13 do is the 12 downloads all of the prerequisites you need automatically for you, so you don't have to go hunt for them. Not just the one that the prerequisite installer needs, but also the additional prerequisites that you need for SharePoint. So 11 creates the folders, 12 sucks down everything you need and puts them in the folders, and then 13 takes your DVD and copies it into the folder that it needs to go into. So by the time you run those 3 scripts, you've got all the files you need. Then you're going to be able to start going to your server and start building the server up. Now, we're going to leave Windows and Windows updates for Johan Advidmark to talk about at Ignite, that sort of Windows deployment. We are going to then jump into what you put on top of Windows. So what you're going to need to put on first, as you know, are the SharePoint prerequisites. And SharePoint prerequisites are scripted with a file called prerequisiteinstaller.txt. File server script 14 will open that file up for you automatically, and all you have to do is change the server path to match yours. So that will create that script for you. And then SharePoint script 22 actually installs the prerequisites using the prerequisite installer. So that builds that layer. The SharePoint scripts 23 to 25 do all the things that the prerequisite installer doesn't do. As you might know in SharePoint, the prerequisite installer doesn't go the whole way. There's a couple of things for each version of Windows that you need to add on. Those scripts take care of that. SharePoint script 31 runs setup.exe and scripts SharePoint installation. Script 51 applies updates, so you can apply the latest cumulative update. And then script 61 runs the equivalent of psconfig to either create a new farm from the server or add the server to a farm. So all the scripts are there for you. And again, you'll get them all. If you have any questions about them, you can email me. But what I really want to talk about is what happens next and how you can take that to even the next level. Because after you have installed SharePoint, you still have a long ways to go. You still have to configure your farm's administrative settings. You have to go through all the other things you have to do to build the farm. So you want to automate that bare metal deployment as much as possible. And one of the best ways you can do that is by creating images of your servers, so that rather than starting with Windows and building SharePoint on top of it, you start with a fully complete, or at least as fully complete as possible, SharePoint server. And the way you do that in this sort of stack that we're talking about is you build SharePoint up to the point of applying the SharePoint updates, but you don't yet join the server to a farm, and you don't yet create a new farm. So that last step of psconfig isn't done yet. And you use the Windows deployment tools to create an image of that server. There's a tool, if you're not familiar with it, called sysprep that takes basically or prepares a machine to be imaged. And so it takes this server that's just perfect and does just what Windows needs to do to make it imageable. And then the Windows deployment tools will capture that image and allow you, the next time you need a SharePoint server, to simply deploy that server onto bare metal, all ready to go. Once that new server has been deployed, which is a matter of minutes, all you then have to do is run psconfig, which is SharePoint script 61, and you're either creating a new farm with that server, maybe a new dev farm, or you're adding a server to your farm and extending and scaling that farm out. So you've saved yourself huge amounts of time by having the perfect image of that SharePoint server. Does that make sense? All right. And the things you want to look at for that are, if you're not familiar with them, are how to use sysprep and the Windows deployment tools to capture that image and deploy it. And it's a very straightforward process, but you want to build that in and get yourself out of the pain of installing servers step by step by step every single time. Because once you've got this is pretty much good as your server image until there's a significant update to SharePoint. So you might, for example, create an image that's up to date for Service Pack 1, and then you may not even have to worry about updating that image again until Service Pack 2 comes out or something like that. Now, when an update does come out, we want to make it as easy as possible for you to apply that update and update your image itself. So the way you're going to do that is, in addition, what we talked about so far was capturing the image of the fully updated server. There's going to be one more image you create, which is actually at the step before. As you're building your perfect server, you're going to take an image at the SharePoint level, indicated here on the slide, and you're going to create an image of that as well. So you're actually going to do that before you apply the first Service Pack 1, for example. And that image then is going to be your base SharePoint image. And when Service Pack 2 comes out, you're going to deploy that onto a new machine, add Service Pack 2, and then capture that as your new updated image that you'll deploy in the future. So you're going to have sort of your base SharePoint image as well as a fully updated image. And when you need to update the updated image, you start with this level and add the appropriate update. And one other note is what happens if there's a major update to Windows itself, if there's some security updates or other patches to Windows. The Windows deployment tools have a tool called DISM that actually will let you inject that Windows update into the image directly. It literally sort of pokes that update into your image so you don't even have to create a new image. It just updates it with the Windows deployment tools. All right, questions on that idea? All right. Speaking of updates, one of the things I see regularly being thought is updating SharePoint servers and farms. So I'd like to make a couple of notes, just sort of quick hit again about updates. First of all, there are cumulative updates. And as most of you know, Microsoft releases these cumulative updates on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And these updates are not fully regression tested. So they haven't been tested against every possible scenario that Microsoft would test a service pack. And unfortunately, the history of these cumulative updates has been rocky at best. How many of you have been bitten by a cumulative update? Yeah, OK, that's a lot. So people have justifiable concerns about applying cumulative updates in their environment. So my guidance on cumulative updates is the same as almost anyone else you would talk to in SharePoint, which is on an existing farm, only deploy cumulative updates if they solve a known problem that you know you have. Don't just apply a cumulative update because Microsoft released it. And of course, you're going to deploy it in a lab first, not deploy it first on your production environment. So on an existing farm, only deploy updates if they solve an issue. Now, when you do deploy an update, and many of you have seen it, they can take a long time to apply, many tens of minutes. And that's partly because there are SharePoint services that are sort of contending for attention while you're trying to deploy this update. And so one of the tricks in applying updates is to shut down a bunch of the SharePoint services first. Then you apply the update, and it's much faster, and then you restart the services. And so in the package of scripts I'm giving you, there's a script, it's SharePoint script 52. I'll show it to you here. So if we go into the SharePoint branch of the file, you'll see script 52, install SharePoint update. And let's take a quick look at that one here. And again, you're going to just point it to your cumulative update. This was an old script here, but August 2013. And then it goes through, and let's see if I can find some good stuff here. Yeah, it stops IIS. It stops the timer service. It stops some search services. Then it applies your update. Goes through all of that, and then it starts services back up again. And so just by running this script and pointing it at your most recent cumulative update, you'll find that those updates install much faster. Yes, of course.
The updates, is that a supported method? I hate to have to ask because I know you can get in problems if you update with CUs wrong, if you don't follow the right process.
Yes. Oh, yes. So his question is the process I'm using on the script supported? Yes, these scripts actually came from Microsoft's sites. Okay. So yeah, they're supported. Now on a newly deployed farm, if you're deploying a brand new farm, my general practice with customers is actually to deploy with the latest cumulative update, because it's not like you're going to break something that's already in place. So my guidance is generally existing farm, don't deploy cumulative updates unless you know them, you need them. On a new farm, I generally deploy the latest cumulative update, but I always wait at least a couple of weeks to listen to everyone else's screams of pain before I decide a cumulative update is good or not. Now in SharePoint 2016, the update process, everything about updates is going to change significantly. And if you're interested in some of the preview of what's going to happen, you can listen to Tech Talk Episode 2. We have web shows on IT Unity, and we have them recorded. Bill Baer did a session that he sort of set up the stage for what they're going to announce at Ignite. And the long story short is they recognize that cumulative updates and the updating of all the different pieces of Windows and SharePoint are quite painful for us. They are going to announce a pretty decent solution for us. Actually a very good solution, and so you'll find that a lot of the pain we faced in the past is going to go away with the way they're going to deploy it. And if you think about one of the big messages that Jeremy mentioned this morning with SharePoint 2016 is what they're now calling cloud-inspired architecture, which basically means they're going to give us on-prem architectural and manageability elements that they've worked out in Office 365. Because obviously, they don't spend half an hour updating every single server in every data center in Office 365. They've figured out how to make it work, and they're going to bring that goodness down to us on-prem. So we can be looking forward to a much better update story with SharePoint 2016. So obviously, service packs are regression tested, so generally speaking, you do want to get those deployed as quickly as possible. I wish I could say that my customers actually were good at that. Many of my customers running SharePoint 2010 still haven't installed Service Pack 1 for SharePoint 2010. It's pretty scary, and when you ask them why, the reason is always the same. We don't know what's going to break. It's very important that as organizations, we start understanding our environments and what our portfolio of services is enough to be able to test things effectively. Because the world is moving too fast, security vulnerabilities are being exploited too quickly. We really need to get on top of that as organizations. Now, one of the things that I'd like to give you as food for thought regarding updates is you have an option, if you're worried about what's going to break, of not exactly updating your farm. You can do what I call a rolling update. Imagine you've got your farm over here on the left, and Microsoft has released an update. Instead of applying it to that farm and risking something breaking, you could build another farm, move your content databases over to it, and attach. And then, you've got everything working, but you've still got your old environment. And once you're sure that it's working, you can get rid of that old environment. Now, that's particularly easy if you're dealing with virtual servers, right? And this is not too far different from how Microsoft operates Office 365 in order to keep things moving along smoothly, is rather than patching an existing environment, build a new one and move over. And how easy is it to build a new environment? Not easy if everything you built was point and click. Pretty easy if everything's scripted. Another big benefit of scripting your environment, I mentioned, was updating, and this is where you start to see that. You can build a new farm, blow out all your configuration with your PowerShell scripts, and then move your content databases over, and you've got an updated farm. Now, this may be a little extreme for some organizations, but I'll give you another scenario where this really helps, and that is when you need to apply an update and you've got, let's call them mission-critical workloads that can't suffer much downtime. I have a number of clients who do something like this when they update, but they don't move they build a new environment. They don't necessarily move all the content databases over, but they move the ones that are mission critical so that while they update the production farm, those mission critical workloads can keep working. So then they update the production farm, then they bring the mission critical workloads back into that production farm. So that's the way they keep those things running quickly. Does that make sense? Okay. So those are a couple points on updates. Now, let's talk a little bit about SQL Server installation. And I'm only going to talk a little bit about this because most of us don't spend a lot of time installing SQL. But if you do, you know it takes a long time to install SQL effectively. If you're pointing and clicking, it's a long, long wizard. And there's some nice tricks to automating that as well. And it all starts with the option of using scripts or images. And we'll talk about both here. For scripts, SQL can do a scripted installation, and SQL actually writes the script for you. When you install SQL with the wizard and you click, 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 it is actually recording your answers in what's called a configuration file. And just when you click install at the very last step, it's actually then running that configuration file. So when you get to that last step, the script is actually fully built. And all you have to do is capture that script, make a couple of little changes to it that I'll talk about, and then you can then take that script to any environment, and you can run setup.exe/configuration file, point to the configuration file you built, and you now have scripted SQL. Now, this configuration file is stored, as mentioned here, deep inside the program files. So as you're going through the wizard, it's building it, and it looks something like this. And in my bundle of scripts, I'm going to give you a sample. So this comes from a SQL 2012 installation. So I installed SQL 2012. I click through the wizard. You wouldn't want to use this against 2014 or even an R2. Go through the wizard once, build one yourself. But as you can see, it's just basically a bunch of questions and answers. So we can see here the features that I chose to install when I ran through the wizard. And all you have to do is make a couple of very small changes. You have to set quiet to true. You have to put in the product ID if your version of SQL requires a product ID. You have to agree to the license agreement. And there's one more change. You have to comment out UI mode equals normal. So you add a little semicolon to the front. So you open up the script that the wizard built for you in that location, you make those 4 changes, you run setup.exe pointing to it, and you've now scripted a SQL installation. Again, great for dev environments, very, very simple, and it works with all versions of SQL. Any questions on that one? All right. There's a couple of other things you have to do after you install SQL. You have to set maximum degrees of parallelism, and I've got a script that does that for you in the batch of scripts for SQL. You have to open the firewall ports. There's a script that does that for you. And you have to create the SQL login for your SharePoint administrator account and give it the permissions it needs. And I've got a script there for you as well. So in that bundle of scripts, you'll have scripts that do every bit of the SQL setup for SharePoint. And before I go on to the next topic, I'll mention that SQL can also be imaged. So the SQL does support building an image of a SQL server and then deploying that image. The steps are a little bit more nuanced than they were with SharePoint. So back in an earlier slide, trust me, there's a point that says go to TechNet, and TechNet has the resources for how to image and deploy SQL Server. Any questions on SQL Server installation that I can answer for you right now? Yeah. Great question. Yeah, so his question is, do I ever extend this to doing things like setting the temp DB settings, content databases? The answer is I would love to. That's actually very high on my list. I'm not enough of a SQL person to do that. So if you want to work with me on it, and I'd love to, and we can get it up on IT Unity. That would be a great script to add, is that last mile. Yeah, so we can definitely talk about that. Now, one of the things that a lot of customers don't do enough when they're setting up SQL and SharePoint is working with SQL aliases. Now, this is a very small thing, and if you know aliases, you can rest for 2 minutes, because I'm not going to probably say much that you don't know. But if you haven't been using aliases, you really, really need to. A SQL alias is simply a fake name for your SQL server, so that you can refer to the SQL server that the SQL server might actually be called nysql05.contoso.com, but you can refer to it as spprod SQL 01. And then if you ever move your databases to, let's say, NYSQL cluster, all you have to do is redefine the alias. You don't have to go into the 45 databases that you have for SharePoint and reconfigure those web applications and service applications to point to the new server. All you have to do is redefine the database. Redefine the alias. So it gives you the flexibility to move databases from place to place without having to reconfigure lots and lots of stuff with SharePoint. Now, the way you configure an alias if you're using the UI is to use a tool called cliconfig.exe. So cliconfig.exe. You go into the aliases tab and you add an alias. We create a TCP alias. In this case, in this example, the alias would be spprod SQL 01. And the server name would be NYSQL05. And you can obviously put in a port here as well. So once we've defined this alias one time, we then use that alias for everything we configure in SharePoint. And if you think of SharePoint as a stack of technologies, SharePoint's way up at the top. And when SharePoint needs to talk to SQL, SharePoint does not talk directly to SQL. SharePoint goes down the stack of technologies to the SQL client running on the same machine, and the SQL client goes and connects to the SQL server. So the SQL client is the connector between the SharePoint part of the stack on the box over to another box running SQL. And so the alias is being defined in the client. It's the one place you have to define that name, and if ever we change the name of our SQL server, all we have to do is change that one element right there. So it's a pretty simple concept. It can be done in the UI. It needs to be done on each SharePoint server in the farm, because each one is its own stack of technologies with its own SQL client at the bottom. There's a script in the SharePoint part of the file, since it's being run on each SharePoint server. Script 41 will configure that alias for you automatically on each SharePoint server. So far, so good? All right. Now, even for those of you who use aliases, a couple of other notes here. Don't use a DNS CNAME as a SQL alias. DNS, Domain Name Services, has alias records. They're called CNAMEs. But it's not generally a good idea to use CNAME records for anything, because they make managing Kerberos a lot more difficult. In the end, what happens is the SQL client thinks it's talking to server A. DNS changes it to server B. But in the meantime, the SQL client has gone to Active Directory and gotten tried to get a ticket, a Kerberos ticket for server A, which doesn't really match server B's name. And so when you start using DNS CNAME records, you have to do a lot more work with the service principal names on your Kerberos side. So generally speaking, you don't want to use CNAME records at all, definitely not for your SQL aliases. Another sort of nuance to think about with aliases is if you're building a new environment, and if you think you're going to scale and it's going to get big, the way you're going to scale your SQL infrastructure is by separating out different types of databases onto different SQL instances. So typically speaking, you might put your content databases on one instance, you might have your search databases on another, you might have service applications on a third. So that's what's going to happen over time as you scale out your SQL infrastructure. If you know in advance you're going to do that, I would suggest you create 3 aliases now, even if you point all 3 aliases to one server. Because then when you do move your search databases onto server 2, all you have to do is change that SP search alias to point to server 2. So it gives you the flexibility of scaling out different types of databases by having a few extra aliases in your pocket from day one. Does that make sense? All right. Moving on. After you built SharePoint up, you have the option of starting to configure what's on your farm. And as many of you know, you never, ever, ever should run the SharePoint configuration wizard. Because there's all these things that have to be done in the process of making a farm real. And the farm configuration wizard makes a lot of decisions that simply aren't going to serve you well in the short term, let alone the long term. I actually just had one of my bigger clients call me, and they're like, oh, we just got this new farm up and running over the weekend, and I knew they weren't good enough to get it done that quick. And I said, how did you do it? Oh, just click, click, click through the wizard. I'm like, we're rebuilding that farm. And they weren't happy, but I explained why, and we literally spent the next couple of days scripting an installation for them to rebuild. So do use scripts to do the things that you would do post-installation as well. And there are some options for you for how to do this. I'm going to give you in my set of scripts a set of samples that will do a certain number of your service applications and web application setups. There is Auto SP install, which is a Codeplex project. Gary and I are going to be working on some scripts on IT Unity. And Gary, you're doing some scripted setup in your session here at Evolution, right? Sorry? On the content side. Perfect. And then some of the different sessions that are talking about specific service applications, we'll talk about deploying those service applications as well. So take the time to find the resources you need to script out your post-installation as well as your pre-installation. Once you've gotten your farm built, you start needing to make architectural decisions. And one of those is how many web applications and site collections you should have. And this is an old discussion, but I still find people making very poor decisions here. And so I'm just going to beat this one into the ground. And that is you need lots and lots of site collections. In the end, your architecture is going to be very horizontal with lots of site collections. And the way I like to describe it is a site collection represents a unit of work. That could be a department, it could be a team, it could be a project, it could be a legal matter, as Jeremy pointed out today, a single case for a law firm. Each unit of work needs to be its own site collection. And the reason for this is that site collections scope a lot of controls of how you manage information and service in SharePoint. All of these are scoped at the site collection level, and some of them are pretty critical. And if you had every single unit of work in your environment was going to be managed the exact same way across all these dimensions, then you could have one site collection. As soon as a unit of work varies in any one of these dimensions, you have to have it in a separate site collection if you want to actually manage it fully. And so there's a lot of controls scoped at the site collection level that drive you to need a lot of site collections. Another way to think about this is that there's a reason on-prem farms you are allowed 250,000 site collections. If you're only using one, that probably should suggest to you that you're not using SharePoint the way it was built. In Office 365, you're allowed 500,000 site collections. There's a reason why Office 365 groups, which are the new experience that will drive collaboration moving forward, there's a reason why behind the scenes each group is a site collection. There's a reason why in Jeremy's discussion of the Matter Center this morning, which is the new legal demo that he showed, every single case is a site collection. So as you're thinking about should we have fewer or more site collections, the answer is going to be more. Now you do need to be aware there's costs of having multiple site collections. As you know, when you create subsites within a site collection, the navigation creates itself. When you have separate site collections, it doesn't. So you're going to have to solve that. As soon as you have multiple site collections and you hire a new employee, yes, they're probably going to need permission to lots of site collections. When you want to roll up content, you're going to need to start using things like search aggregators and search web parts. So there are definitely things you're going to have to work out, but the costs the costs need to be worked out. You need to go with more site collections. It will hurt you if you don't. So the last way I could suggest that you think about this is just trust me and everyone else who says this, because it's really true. So any questions just on that sort of point of going horizontal in your architecture? All right. Now, in order to make this a lot easier, I'm going to skip the hostname site collection part here for a second. In order to make this a lot easier, you definitely want to automate site provisioning. You want to make creating sites, especially your standard collaboration sites, as fast and as easy as possible. There are some sessions at this event. Gary's going to talk about some of them. Victor is doing some. So there are some sessions on different ways of provisioning. There are some third-party tools that do site collection provisioning. You can look at those. I also have a session I did at the SharePoint conference last year that showed a very simple way to provision sites, and I'll give you a glimpse of that in a moment as well. So find a way that works for you to automate your site provisioning. This is one of those areas of investment that is absolutely worth it. Because when a team needs a site, the IT organization's response should not be, we'll give that site to you within 3 weeks. And I have customers who literally, it's a 3-week response time to create a team site. That's crazy. It needs to be something that when a normal team needs a normal space for collaboration, it can be delivered immediately without burdening the IT organization. So invest some time or invest some money creating a tool for provisioning. It's a great space to be. So look for those sessions here. They'll be good sessions. Any questions on site collections as they've been? All right. Where site collections are going and comparing them to Office 365 groups. Many of you will have heard the buzz about Office 365 groups, and let me pull up a quick site collection here to show you one in action. I forgot to open this up in advance. I apologize. Okay, old school site collection. Oops, still rendering. The new groups metaphor is one that currently you enter either from Outlook web app or you enter from your People app. And once you're in a group, you've got the sort of basic interface that we're seeing right now, and it exposes some of the capabilities of groups right now. So as of currently, groups consist of a shared calendar, a set of files, which behind the scenes is a document library in a SharePoint site collection for that group, one-to-one mapping, a OneNote notebook, and then what they call a conversation, just to make our lives more complicated than they were already. It's not Yammer, it's not SharePoint newsfeed. We're back to distribution lists because the feature as we have it right now was built by the Exchange team. But already they provide some interesting capabilities for a limited scope of groups. This is version 1 of groups as we have it right now. And let's just talk about the distribution list for a second. One of the, many organizations have distribution lists for groups, for teams. That's nothing new. But one of the challenges we have is when a new employee joins the organization and they jump midstream into a team, they don't have access to that whole history of that distribution list under traditional distribution lists. With the construct of a group, that distribution list is associated with the group, and there's a history of it. So when a new employee comes into that group, they actually have the conversations, the distribution list saved and presented in the group interface. So Microsoft is starting to address what we've really been trying to do with teams in our organization. And this is, if you haven't had a chance to read Microsoft's blog post last week called Dynamic Teams, I would put that towards the top of your should be read list because it reveals a lot about Microsoft's thinking and what they're going to be doing with groups and with other features moving forward. So the group experience as it is right now is fundamental. It's not super rich yet, but it's a start. And I already sort of listed out the capabilities. Now, if you think about that, you'll see some overlap with what we've had in team sites in the past. And team sites still have all the functionality that SharePoint has always had. That's not going away anywhere. But groups is starting to take on some of that functionality. What groups gives us, however, is a richer experience in a couple of ways. First, the group experience, as you might have been able to tell just from seeing it already, is going to be more responsive and more adaptive as you go across devices. So as where the SharePoint team site experience in Office 365 today hasn't really changed for 3 years. And you would think if they were going to do something with it, we would start seeing that, right? Instead, they're investing in these newer experiences that give us a richer UI across platforms and devices, and that also pull in services from multiple Office 365 components. So the groups is pulling in distribution lists from Exchange. It's pulling in OneNote. It's pulling in OneDrive for Business. It's going to be pulling in Yammer. It's going to be pulling in all kinds of new things that they're going to announce in 2 weeks. And so the group is this new experience that has richer functionality as well as a UI that's going to be more responsive and adaptive moving forward. So there's going to be a lot coming down the pike here to enable groups to support dynamic teams. For example, one of the things they've announced publicly, although in a very small voice, is that they're going, that on the very top of their list is the ability to start adding external users to your groups. Because most of us in our organizations are pulling in partners, contractors, vendors, and so the ability to bring in external users is very important, and that will happen. They're going to be adding lots and lots of new functionality. Keep an eye on groups during Ignite. You're going to see some amazing, amazing stuff. The experience is going to get much richer. It's going to be a much more, what should I say, adoptable experience. Users, when they get into a group, will immediately be able to understand what the group is about, where it's going, and what it's about. So keep a very close eye on Ignite. And so the guidance for groups, as if you're thinking about today, should I create a team site or use a group, I would say first, definitely learn about and start testing groups because they are clearly going to be an emphasis in the future. Pay very close attention to Ignite. And realize that over time, most collaboration workloads, are going to belong in groups. Now keep in mind that SharePoint sites are more than just collaboration. There's dashboards, there's all kinds of other things we're doing in team sites. That's not the workload that is for groups. But the typical collaboration is going to become richer and a richer experience in groups. So keep your eye very closely on it. And if you have to make a decision, in the next couple of weeks about which to use, test groups out. And if they are suited, and they may not be, but if they are suited already, start using those. You'll be well set moving forward. And the fact that groups, if you look at their architecture, do have a one-to-one relationship with a site collection is another indication of why you probably should have lots of site collections. Each team, each group in a current environment should be its own site collection because that will also help you migrate that workload into groups when groups come, when you're ready to move those into groups. Any questions on groups versus site collections? All right, let's move on to some security stuff. Administrators. Administrative delegation is an interesting thing, and there's a couple of little nuances that a lot of customers haven't quite gripped. And the first deals with farm administrators. So we all know farm administrators are your gods in your SharePoint environment. They create the farm, they manage central administration, and in the end, a farm administrator has the potential to access any content in SharePoint. Now, and the reason is because a farm administrator owns site collections, and so a farm administrator could make themselves a site collection administrator. And once you're a site collection administrator, you have access to all content in the site collection, and you cannot be denied that access. So farm administrators are certainly powerful to begin with, but they have the potential to be all-powerful in your environment. Now, what is in the farm administrators group? Well, in the farm administrators group, you're adding your actual administrators, but you also have the local administrators group. The local administrators group is, by default, a member of the farm administrators group. And I should be a little bit more specific, which is the local administrators group on the server running central administration is also in the farm administrators group. Now, ideally, your administrators group should be the same across all your SharePoint servers. But technically, it's the one on the central administration server. Now, this becomes particularly interesting because there are situations where someone might need to be a Windows administrator on a box, but really shouldn't be a farm administrator. Think about a customer who outsources the management of their Windows servers to, let's say, a Dell, an HP, whoever. So they are actually giving control of their boxes to a third party. Whoever is in that administrator's group from that third party has the potential to access all content in SharePoint, which these days can end up being a pretty mission-critical and sensitive set of information. And that's something you need to think about if you're in one of those situations where your Windows team is different than your SharePoint team, particularly if your Windows team is an external party. You really need to understand that overlap because it may be not appropriate to administer your Windows servers running SharePoint the same way you administer your Windows SharePoint servers running other things. So be very, very aware of that overlap there. The other interesting nuance to the administrators group is that even if you are a farm administrator, there are things you won't be able to do unless you're also a local administrator. Specifically, things like creating and deleting web applications, starting and stopping services. Those things require you to be a local administrator. So if I add you to the farm administrators group, but don't add you to the local administrators group on the server, those tasks will be dimmed. They will be disabled in central administration. And I've had customers like, why can't I start a service? Why can't I delete a web application? And that's why. So one of the things I recommend you do in your environments is leverage Active Directory group policy. Group policy allows you to say who the administrators are going to be and then scope it to all of your SharePoint servers. So through group policy, you can say, my local administrators are every single one of my farm administrators. And when I add a farm administrator in SharePoint, I also add them to the group policy definition of who the administrator should be. That group policy gets applied to all the servers, and that person ends up in the administrators group on all the servers as well. So that's just something to keep in mind there. And in fact, that's not on the deck, so I'm actually going to add that right now. There's a little pointer here. I've been meaning to add that forever. Keep administrators group in sync across SharePoint servers. My mouse is on an angle here. Use group policy. All right, a little addition there. All right, and given our time, I think, yeah, we'll do this. After the farm administrators, the next powerful group in your environment is, of course, your site collection administrators. And this is a small point. Some of you will be familiar with this, but just to clarify, there's actually two different types of users that are both called site collection administrators. And it's very, very unfortunate. There's a set that are defined in central administration when you create the site collection. That's your primary and secondary site collection administrator. And then there's a set that's defined in the site collection itself. So in central administration, you get to define two. In the site collection, you get to define a whole lot. I like to think of them as the two and the many. So there's two separate definitions here. On the central administration side, they're often called the owner and the secondary contact. On the site collection side, you can have as many as you want, and they're called site collection administrators. On the central administration side, they can only be users. Your primary and secondary must be user accounts. On the site collection side, you can actually use user or group accounts. Now, regardless of where someone is defined as site collection administrator, they have basically the same permissions. They have full control of content, can't be denied, and full access to all settings to do good or evil with. The only difference between these two separate definitions of site collection administrators is that the two, the primary owner and the secondary contact, get two types of email notifications. Specifically, quota notifications. The site collection is running out of space, or the site collection has run out of space. And site use confirmation and deletion emails, where it says, this site hasn't been used for 90 days. We're going to delete it. Really, we're going to delete it. OK, it's been deleted. So those two types of notifications get sent to the two, not to the many. So the group doesn't. So that's the difference between the two. Everyone okay so far? All right, now with that in mind, what's the best practice? What should you put in each? Now, this is a place where there's not a best practice, but I'll tell you what I do with my customers and why. On the site collection owners, the primary and the secondary, I actually set those up to be service accounts, not to be used by human beings. So I put this SP admin account, which is the SharePoint setup administration account that you use to set up the farm. I make that as the primary site collection administrator in every site collection. And I have an automation account that I use to run all my scripts. So for example, my site provisioning script runs as SP automation. And that is the other site collection owner that's defined in central administration. So the primary and the secondary are actually not human beings. They're used almost like service accounts. Then in the site collection itself, where you define the site administrators, the same two users go in there. They go in there automatically. But then I add an Active Directory group that contains all of the human beings that I want to be site collection administrators across every site collection. So if we jump to one of my site collections here, see if I can find the right server. And let's go into the finance site. And I'm going to go into site settings. Whoops, did I hit it? Site must have gone to sleep while I was waiting to come up on stage here. There we go, site collection administrators. You can see here that the first listed account is actually an Active Directory group called SP Site Admins. And so my human administrators that I want to be in every site collection get added into that group. That group is in every site collection administrators group and every site collection I create. And then obviously certain site collections will have additional administrators depending on the business requirements for that site collection. That make sense? Any questions on that one? Yeah. Very good question. What's to stop people from deleting? I'll give you a Transition King crown, because I believe that's one of my next bullet points here. Establish monitoring and notification processes. You do want to be watching these groups, these all-powerful groups for changes, farm administrators and site collection administrators. And you can do that with by looking at audit logs. You can do it by running PowerShell scripts occasionally against those site collections. You can do it with third-party tools. Most of the good third-party administrative tools have sort of enforcement and monitoring procedures for those sensitive groups. So that's something you definitely want to do. There's no one best way to do it. Does anyone have a favorite way of doing it in this room? All right, definitely something you want to do though. Now the one thing that won't happen when you do this structure that I've got are, remember those 2 email notifications I mentioned? Those only go to the 2 accounts defined in central administration. So I mentioned those are service accounts in my implementations. So how do we make sure that those quota notifications and site use confirmation emails get to the right people? Well, the answer is to have a shared inbox. So we create a shared inbox, and we, wait, let me make sure I remember what with my build here. I'm trying to remember my build. Have a shared inbox, and that email address is then associated with those 2 service accounts. So the email notifications that are going to those 2 service accounts go to an email address. That email address is a shared inbox, and you give all of your SharePoint site collection administrators access to that shared inbox. So it basically becomes a support. It basically becomes a support inbox. Questions on that thought? All right. So this is just one sort of thought, is that the site collection administrators group in SharePoint is kind of the all-powerful group when you get down to the content level. And that power can be used for good or for evil. So it's very helpful wherever possible to keep those site collection administrators groups as lean as possible. Don't make someone a site collection administrator without the right training and without really understanding why they need that power. Many times they need to do something just once. And rather than put them in the site collection administrators group so they can do that one thing and then have all kinds of power they don't need moving forward, find a way to do that action for them. whether it's an escalated help desk ticket or whether it's a third-party tool that delegates those tasks to them. Find some way to get that away from them. All right, so now I'm going to pick some things to talk about here. And I'm going to give you an example of, where can I find it? Group management here. That was the next thing. So I'm going to close with one sort of point and a way to help manage access in SharePoint. And this also heads towards a way that you could manage the Site Collection Administrators group as well. There are several ways to make managing groups and access easier in SharePoint. Remember, the challenge when you go to multiple site collections is that when you hire a new employee, you have to know where to put that employee in all the different places they need to go. The way I'd like to suggest that you approach this problem is to create a group management application. Now, there are third-party applications that will do this as well, but this is pretty darn easy to create yourself. And I will actually, I'll point out right now that the details for how to do this are in a video that's up on Channel 9 on MSDN. I will also, and in that video, there's links to the scripts that you can use to do this. But let me give you a glimpse of how easy this can be. I'm going to jump up to my SharePoint environment here. And we're going to go back to that finance site. And you'll notice in the finance site, there's 3 users, myself, Linda, and Satya. And I want to give a user, Lota, access to this finance site. She's a new hire in our organization. And there might be other sites she needs access to as well. And I'm going to demo this first, and then we'll talk about how it's done. I'm going to create a request to add Lota to the finance site. And again, I think, OK, here we go. I'm going to add Lota to the finance sites members group. And why? Because she is a new hire and that's her primary role. Now, when you think about managing groups and access in any environment, one of the things that never happens is documenting why something was done, and often who did it and when. Now, who did it and when, you can dig into audit logs, but whoever actually does that, right? Why not create an interface that does it for you automatically? And that's what's happening here. We're capturing the request to add Lota to that finance site. We're capturing who made that request and a very important piece of information, which is why. And when you look at almost every compliance regulation on the planet, it boils down to, are you making best efforts to document why you're doing things? And the audit logs never, ever talk about why. They just talk about who's and whens. So we just made this request. And the SLA for this particular request is 5 minutes. But rather than wait, I'm going to go ahead and kick that SLA off right now. If we had a few minutes, I would just talk and stall. But we'll actually make it happen. And hopefully, if the gods of live demos are working with me, I will come back to the finance site and hit refresh. Oh. And there she is. She's now in that group. And back here on the request page, if I refresh this page, we can see that the request to add Lota, which is the last one here, was completed on this particular date. Now, this application is ridiculously easy from a structural perspective. It is a SharePoint list, nothing fancy, that is collecting the request. There is then a scheduled task running every 5 minutes that runs a PowerShell script with elevated credentials. So whoever has access to the list is allowed to make the request. It could be a non-privileged user. The PowerShell script runs with privileges. The PowerShell script then connects to the list, looks for unfulfilled requests, and executes those requests. So it adds Lota to the group, and it logs that request back to the list to indicate its success. Super simple framework, but completely secure. And when you look at every third-party administrative tool, this is how they work. They have a non-privileged request or interface, a privileged service that executes the request, and a log. And this is super, super easy to create. So again, the slide deck has the link to the video. This is up on MSDN that can show you how. I will actually bundle the scripts for this into your zip file for this session so you can look at it. but it is a very, very simple infrastructure. And this infrastructure is how you can also look at automating any other administrative task. Have a request that's non-privileged, a PowerShell script that connects to the list and executes it, and logs the results. And that then helps you reduce how many people need to be site collection administrators. Because if people just need to be site collection administrators to turn on a feature, you could actually create the same infrastructure to let people turn on a feature in a site collection. They can make a request as a non-privileged user, and you can have a privileged service or PowerShell script that executes it. So this is a really, really useful framework to think about in managing SharePoint and also managing any other service you've got. Questions on this framework? All right. Well, like I said, tons and tons to talk about. I hope you've enjoyed this set of the grab bag. These are the kinds of things addressing these kinds of problems that we all face that we hope to put more and more of on IT Unity. A lot of what I talked about today is PowerShell, so please go to Gary LaPointe's sessions later this week. He is the man. He is the guru. Anything that I ever need to do moving forward with this stuff, I'm going to be talking to him about, not to put any pressure on him. But he's going to be doing some awesome sessions here as well. Enjoy the rest of Evolution. If you've got any questions, come on up and ask. I look forward to seeing you tonight at SharePoint. Have a great one.